I'm not surprised because this is low-hanging fruit, but we've got to be slightly cautious because this is at the moment five frogs on a log. And that is one decides to jump off, how many are left? And the answer is five, because deciding and doing are two different things. And we've already had conditions imposed by the Russians, which will need to be worked through, including access to the SWIFT system and banking system for their insurance companies. So there still needs to be a little bit of reticence about this. But in terms of the payoff matrix, which is what we look for on these things, this is potentially a win-win for both sides. It's a minor sanctions relief for Russia, and it allows the Ukrainians to get their grain out unimpeded. It's a sort of confidence building measure, but this doesn't mean that there'll be a linear progression to an immediate and full ceasefire. As I said, this is low hanging fruit. So one of the key things we've still not had yet is the implementation of an energy infrastructure deal. And of course, that shows you part of the problem. So what is energy infrastructure? Striking a substation which supplies electricity to civilians. That's an act of against against the acts laws of war. Whereas striking a oil refinery which powers the sinews of war because of the money which accrues is not an act of war, and that shows some of the problems we're going to have in just looking at energy infrastructure before we get to the nitty-gritty of can we get an enduring ceasefire. And I think we have to always remember that wars are fought for political objectives, and Russia still sees a military solution to this and will try and play Trump and his advisors until they can get something out of this. But at the moment, they're playing a canny game with sort of signing up to this, but we'll have to wait and see if those conditions mean that it's implemented. We were expecting a pressure strategy when Trump was elected. We thought it would be on Russia. Of course, it came onto Ukraine initially, both in terms of the intelligence being rescinded, the weapons not being given to them, and the satellite feeds going, which would have impeded their deep battles significantly. There were three types of things that we thought the Americans could do to the Russians. The first was ratchet up the sanctions regime, and this does look like it weakens it slightly. The second one was come to the table, and if you don't, in a credible way, then we'll support Ukraine with more weapons. And the third one, which is I think why it's significant potentially that all these talks are in Saudi Arabia, is the oil price. Before he became the president, Trump was talking about getting oil down to $45 per barrel. It's around 70 at the moment. Russia needs a oil barrel price of around 69.70 dollars to feed its war machine. If it were to come down to $45, then that would seriously impede their ability on the economic front to make this war continue for the long term. You've got to try some confidence building measures. I don't think this means that there's a linear progression to a full ceasefire. And I think there's going to be so many impediments to this that ultimately my view is that Trump will ultimately find that they're not honest brokers and honest negotiators, because the grand strategic objectives, as Bill Browder and I would both concur, is that Russia still seeks to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. They've not changed from that desire, and that still seems to be the way they're manipulating. Certainly Witkoff, in the way at the weekend he was talking about sort of almost giving away the five oblasts, which are only partially, apart from Crimea, occupied by Russia and occupied illegally. Zelensky seems to have played a straight bat on this, and that he has welcomed it. And I think that's canny tactics from Zelensky, because in essence, Ukraine won the Battle of the Black Sea. Russia lost the Battle of the Black Sea. So the people who do gain for this, as Bill Browder seems to me to be Russia to a certain degree, but I wouldn't overplay that. Another factor in this, of course, is what's the reaction, for example, of Turkey, who've been pretty hard over on the Montreux Convention about not allowing Russian warships through the Bosphorus Straits, Dardanelles, how they enable this as well. Because one of the things that Turkey's been hard over again is the sovereignty of Ukraine, all its provinces, mainly because of their own Kurdish problem. I do think America will try and do bilateral toing and froing between the two communities to try and get some sort of negotiation towards an enduring ceasefire. That is different than the number of meetings it would probably take to get an enduring settlement, and that means a peace settlement. And so Trump is always in haste, and that's really a problem on these sorts of things. To give you some historical examples, it took 500 meetings in 2 years to bring the armistice to bear in the Korean War in 1953. And it took 5 years to get to the Treaty of Paris and the Vietnam War. These things take time because of the complexities, and it's those complexities on something seemingly as simple as don't have any engagements in the Black Sea, which we'll see if those complexities do come about in the next week or so. So, for example, just a small example would be where do you define the Black Sea in terms of riverine operations, i.e. the big river which separates Kherson province from Odessa, where there have been operations? Is this in international waters? Is it in territorial waters? There's some sort of complexities on all these sort of things. Is reconnaissance allowed in the airspace? There are these technical complexities which can cause fractures in these sorts of agreements which are made in haste. Russia and Ukraine are still at war. Russia still thinks it can achieve its objectives by war. One of the things about advancing armies is that they barely stop fighting when their opponents become weaker. There was no doubt that 2 or 3 weeks ago that Ukraine were weakened by the actions of America. They've since recovered that in turning the taps back on the 11th of March, and we probably saw an example of that with the attacks taking out the 4 helicopters in Belgorod province yesterday, which A, were from HIMARS, and B, could have only been enabled by American intelligence. I think in terms of military orders, it's worth just saying that we look at intent, scheme of maneuver, and main effort. There's no doubt that Trump's intent is to end the war. The difficulty is looking at the scheme of maneuver, the how, where, what, where, when. They're the complexities which will be difficult for the future. But there's no doubt that the main effort for Trump is a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire if he can get it, and negotiations which lead to a substantive peace settlement. One of the scenarios that I think we may subscribe to is that the Helsinki Commission, which looks at Russia-American relations, reported last September, and it reported under a Republican senator from South Carolina, Joe Wilson, who said that ultimately Trump will find that Putin is not an honest broker, that he won't do anything which is substantive, and that when he realizes that, he will go full in and support Ukraine with all the weaponry it needs to prosecute fully, for example, the deep battle, destroying the energy infrastructure, for example, of Russia, which probably would bring them to the table in a substantive way. I mean, Lavrov's comment that a ceasefire is a road to nowhere still lives with me, and I do believe that that's what they fully believe. They believe that they can play Trump. They believe that they can win this war and that they can divide the West and NATO, the EU. They're already in this sort of disengagement strategy of Europe from the US, and that seems to be going quite well without any real help from Putin.